Okay. Welcome, everybody. In the last year, we've seen campus protests both here and across the country about the Israeli-Hamas war. We've seen CEOs of social media companies hauled into Congress. We've heard CEOs of these same companies complain that they were pressured into suppressing content and that they regret having succumbed to that kind of pressure. We have seen the issue of free speech rise in prominence over the last few years. And this event, the goal of this event is to help you better understand what this principle is and relate it to these sorts of controversial issues. So help you think more clearly about it and take the perspective or evaluate the perspective that is presented in this book, The First Amendment, Essays on the Imperative of Intellectual Freedom, which is by Tara Smith, who is a professor of philosophy here at UT Austin, and Gregory Salmieri, who is a senior scholar in philosophy at the Salem Center Program on Objectivism, and my colleague at the Ayn Rand Institute, Ghate, who's a senior fellow and chief philosophy officer there. So our goal today is to have a conversation about these issues. We're going to start with a wide-angle perspective on what is free speech, how does it relate to the issue of intellectual freedom, and then we would love to get your questions. And we're going to have hopefully an extensive audience Q&A. I should also thank the sponsors of this event. The Salem Center Program in Objectivism, which Greg is the director of, is a co-sponsor. And the other organization that we should thank is the Voices for Liberty, which is active in fostering free speech, civil rights, and social progress. We're grateful for them making this event possible. And before I dive into the discussion, I want to mention, for those of you who are UT students, and for those of you who are community members, this is not for you. If you're UT students, you're welcome to pick up a free copy of this book at the end of today's event. We have a limited number, so first come, first served. And if you would like a copy and there are none left, come talk to me. We'll see what we can make happen for you. So with that, let's dive into the conversation. I've introduced you each. I hope I've covered all the relevant information about who you are and what you do here. I'd like to start with this question. This event is titled Free Speech, What It Is and What It Is Not, or What Is Not. Before we answer that, I want to understand how you think of free speech. What is its relationship to the First Amendment? And in the subtitle of the book, you refer to intellectual freedom. What is that? Maybe that's the place to start. Let me turn that to you, Tara.
Sure, thanks. And first, thank you all so much for coming. It's really nice to see you here, and a special shout out to some of my students. So this book, right, it's called The First Amendment because it's got some essays on free speech and some essays in particular on freedom of religion. Freedom of association comes up a lot, and all of those are mentioned in the First Amendment. And the First Amendment, as I understand it, is about intellectual freedom. Intellectual freedom is the sort of the bond or the through line of what the amendment specifically refers to, freedom of speech and of the press and of religion and of petition and of assembly. So I thought it important to call attention to this deeper idea, which has been debate. I mean, religious freedom. We've had a lot of debates about religious freedom cases, controversial cases getting to the high courts in recent years as well. Increasingly, we're going to be seeing freedom of association cases. It comes up with unions and participation and membership in unions, but a lot of the campus protest material concerns that. So intellectual freedom I see as the freedom to think for yourself, which entails to read what you want to read, to write what you want to write, to say, to speak, to listen to on voluntary basis, to come here if you want to. Nobody put a gun to your head. You didn't have to come here, but to think about what we have to say. And, I could go on. It's vital for intellectual freedom I distinguish from what you might call material freedom, freedom to trade, freedom to travel. But the two really go hand in hand. You need to use your mind to figure out what to do in action, in physical action, and your actions will only add up to things that can really help you lead a good life if you're free to assess the evidence, think rationally about things.
So just picking up on that theme of the value of intellectual freedom, I want to turn to you, Greg, and Onkar to build on that and tell me from your perspective why you're personally interested in this topic, why you chose to write about this and speak about this. And just to emphasize that, one thing that unites all the contributions in this book is your expertise in the philosophy of objectivism, the philosophy of Ayn Rand. And I hope you can bring that in and tell us how that's shaped your perspective on intellectual freedom and free speech in particular, how that makes you, why you see its a relationship to that. So maybe start with you, Onkar.
Okay, let me say two things on that. So one, touching on what Tara, you said towards the end. One of the things Ayn Rand stresses, which I think is unique in her understanding of freedom, particularly that she understands this at a deep philosophical level. One of the ways she puts it is that intellectual freedom, economic freedom, and political freedom are aspects of freedom, the corollaries. And to have a fully free society means to have freedom in all three areas. And that impingements on one area imply and entail impingements on the other areas. And that is typically, free speech is not thought about like that anymore. It's thought you can sort of carve it out and you can have all kinds of economic controls and economic restrictions and somehow preserve freedom of speech. And you just can't. And if you thinking in terms of the First Amendment, if you think of some of the jurisprudence, there's a reason why they invented, and I think it's very much they invented, that is the Supreme Court invented, that there's different tiers of scrutiny for if it's commercial speech or if it's considered more political speech. It's a higher level of scrutiny. That is, it's a higher bar for the government to do something to restrict political speech. It's much, much less for commercial speech, for advertisements and things like that. And that's thought of, well, we want to control the economic realm, but there's obviously free speech implications, like advertising is an element of speech. And if we want to control that, we have to say, no, the government can do this. How does the First Amendment says it can't do this. So we lower the level of scrutiny and we lower the bar so the government can do this. And that's a deprivation of freedom. And very few people see this. And Ayn Rand saw this very deeply. This is how the undermining of freedom will work. It will, in part, it will say, well, economics, that's a separate realm, and we can do things here and not impact freedom of speech. And you can't. And part of that we don't have full freedom of speech in the United States today is in part because they've splintered it like this and say we can control one area and somehow it doesn't impact another area. So that's one aspect that I think is, if you're thinking about what Ayn Rand has to say, that is important and I think new. The other is much more a stress, but she really understood that when we're talking about the First Amendment and we're talking about the Bill of Rights, we're talking about individual rights, the right of an individual. And free speech, to the extent that it's defended today, is much more defended as you need it for society, for the development of the society. And the counterpart is, well, no, it's doing social harm, something like hate speech. It's creating social harms, and aren't the harms worse than the benefits of allowing freedom? It's all viewed from a social collectivist perspective. And a real understanding of the First Amendment is it's about individual freedom. It's what the individual needs to flourish, not what a collective needs.
I want to come to you, Greg. So let's take a step back. Maybe you can give us a slightly wider perspective for people who aren't familiar with Ayn Rand's philosophy. What are some key ideas that she has? And then maybe you can relate your perspective on this issue to her wider philosophy and tell us your perspective on intellectual freedom.
Well, let me start by saying first what I think free speech is, and then I'll put it in that context. So free speech is a right. It's an individual right. And a right is a moral principle, as Rand defines it, defining and sanctioning an individual's freedom of action in a social context. What that means is that a right is a principle saying in areas where there might be dispute, where there might be disagreement, where people might come up against each other, whose judgment reigns supreme? Whose decision is it to make? If you and I both want to be in a certain place, who has a right to be there? Who gets to decide this? And individual rights are the principles that define the scope where the choice is up to each individual. Why do we have these things? And then what right is the right to free speech? Well, individual rights are the recognition in the planning of a society, in the structuring of a society, in the building of a social system, of the fact that human lives are and ought to be lived by individual people for their own sake, by their own effort, by their own thinking, by their own judgment, life in general is a process, and this is all some of Rand's ideas that I'm elaborating on. Life in general is a process by which an organism sustains itself. Life is a doing, something a living thing does. It's not something you have, but it's something you're engaged in, whether you're a plant or an animal or a human being. There's an activity, a process that is that life. And for human beings, it's a process of thought-guided and thought-directed action, a process of figuring out how to meet your needs, figuring out what you want out of life, and directing yourself over time to do that thing. There's not some fixed set of things we need and some fixed way that we pursue them. Human life is creative, it's rational, it's dynamic, and it involves interacting with people in all sorts of ways, each in pursuit of their own life by their own judgment for their own sake. And so the question is, then how do people doing that interact with one another such that living in a society with other people is an unalloyed benefit for them? And in order for it to be an unalloyed benefit, the society has to be run on certain principles. And the principles are respecting that each person is an individual, living his own life for his own sake, by his own judgment. And that in order for other people to be a benefit and not a threat to him, it needs to be organized in such a way that people's interactions with one another are voluntary rather than forced upon one another. That if I have dealings with all of you or each of you or any one of you, it's because both of us are in it consensually rather than anyone forcing themselves on anybody else. And then in that context, what is the right to freedom of speech? What is free speech? It's the fact that in speaking, in merely voicing and articulating my opinion, I am not forcing myself on anybody. And therefore I have the right to do that. But I don't have the right to shout in your ear or force myself on you or occupy your house to say things. That's part of your freedom, right? So we have the right to each express our opinions. We don't have the right to force our opinions upon other people. We have the right to express our opinions peacefully to one another and peaceably among people who want to get together to do them. And this right takes its place in the constellation of all of our general freedom to lead our own lives by our own choice, interacting by our own judgment, interacting with one another, where we can have a meeting of the minds and do it voluntarily. And speech is particularly important to highlight in this, because how do you have a meeting of minds and agree with people to deal with them? You have to be able to talk to them and them to you, and so we have to respect the fact that speech isn't just one of the things we do, it's how we communicate, it's how we deal with one another as minds to come to terms with and consent to things with, rather than treating one another as just objects in our environment to exert ourselves upon.
So let me ask you a bit more about that, because Onkar, you raised the point in your comments that one has to think of this as an individual right, not a collective consideration. So one kind of view there are a lot of people who defend free speech, a lot of people who say they're for free speech, but one of the kinds of arguments they make is that we need it in order to accomplish social ends, or it's good for society to have free speech. And I'm interested in your perspective on that. So what do you think of that kind of argument? It clearly sounds like a collectivized perspective, but why is it a problem? Why do you think that? How do you differentiate from that?
Well, there's a reading of that you can put it in individual terms. So as Greg was saying, the individual rights are principles by which to organize a society, and the society that you think is good. So there's a perspective from which it is social in the sense that if you protect each individual's freedom, the result is a prosperous society. But the perspective is that the individual requires this right in order to be able to function. And the moment you take it as your focus is not on individual, but the society is a primary, and the society is what we're trying to evaluate, and the individuals are dispensable. That is a perspective that leads to, we can talk about the issue of John Stuart Mill, who's you said many people defend freedom of speech. He's considered a great defender of it, and I don't think he is, particularly because he, more than anyone else, introduces this kind of social collectivist justification for freedom of speech. And the consequence is that when people think, well, this individual, what they're doing, what they think and what they say and who they want to associate with, we view that as harmful to society. Well, if the society is primary, we're going to clamp down. And it's one of the arguments for hate speech, but for all censorship, it often works in this kind of way, that this person who's a Nazi sympathizer, he's bad for society, and we've got to stop him. And if you have an individualist perspective, it's just radically transformed the way that you think of that question. And I think it's the only way in the end to defend freedom of speech.
Can I add a little bit on that too? So yeah, freedom of speech, a society that really respects individuals' freedom of speech is going to be a lot better off than a society that doesn't. So it's definitely, as a factual, descriptive observation, freedom of speech is conducive to human prosperity, human flourishing. That means individual flourishing. So the matter of fact that the John Stuart Mills and sort of his fans, there's a fact, yeah, it's incredibly valuable to the advance of science, to the advance of understanding of all sorts of things, to have freedom of opinion and exchange and criticism. But that's not, in my view and in Rand's view, that's not why you're entitled to it. Even if you have nothing useful to say, you as an individual, your life is yours. You don't get a right if, oh, that's socially useful. We'll let this guy say that, as long as, we'll give him permission. We, society, will grant him permission to say that, because that's okay. That's socially safe, or that's socially beneficial. But Ankar, sorry, nice guy, what you've got to say just isn't that valuable. No, the individualist perspective is, it comes from my right to my life, to my right to freedom, and as long as what I'm saying isn't infringing on anybody else's rights, and there are some things I can say that would do that, okay, but as long as what I'm saying isn't, then I should be as free as the guy who's got brilliant contributions to make or not. So I think that social perspective picks up on something that is in fact the case, but it's not the justification. And when you use social good as the justification, you don't have rights anymore. You're on a leash, and you will be free as long as society deems it useful for you to be free to say that.
Well, I also want to add something about this, because it's these utilitarian justifications. In other words, we should adopt this policy because it's best for society in general. It maximizes the general good. It's the most useful. Is not a rights-based, not an individualistic, and not a rights-based way of thinking about whatever things you allow someone to do. And so it is true that it will end up in, well, you're not allowed to speak because we don't think what you have to say is useful enough. But even when it doesn't end up in that, even when it's favoring even useless or bad or nasty speech is permitted, it still ends up violating the actual freedom of speech. Because what is freedom of speech in the first place? What is the right? It's not a policy. Freedom of speech is not the fact that if I think Ankar has nothing useful to say, I nonetheless invite him to my house and have him talk at me when I don't think it's useful. Just go on with your example. It's not that I'm an egalitarian in what I'm willing to listen to, in what I'm willing to platform, in what I'm willing to publish in my book, in what I'm willing to allow on my social media platform, in what I'm willing to put on my radio station. It's not the policy of all voices welcome. Welcome to what? Everyone is welcome, in effect, to what they have a right to. Everyone is welcome to live their own life by their own judgment. Everyone's ability to do that has to be protected. Everybody ought to be able to, therefore, say what they want to say on their own property to people willing to listen to them and so forth. But that has absolutely no implications whatsoever to who I should let into my house, what I should tolerate their saying. If I think someone's a Nazi and I think their views are vile and despicable, there's no free speech justification for me helping them to say it or letting them say it in my space. Maybe there's some grounds why it might be useful for me to do this for some purpose. I want to be well-rounded or something, and maybe not. But it's not an issue of free speech. Maybe I'm intolerant in who I'll listen to, and that's bad. But it's not a violation of anyone's free speech. It has nothing whatsoever to do with free speech, except that it's an exercise of my rights, including my right to free speech, to control my property, my platform, etc., and let what things I think are useful on it and what things aren't. So unless you understand it as an individual right and existing in the constellation of other rights we have, including property rights, which are the means of implementing other rights, you don't have a way to conceive of what free speech is. And so you get things like people saying, this platform is or isn't a free speech platform, because to be a free speech platform would be to have no standards and let anything on it. And if it doesn't allow pornography or doesn't allow really vile views in the view of its owner or this or that, then it's against free speech. And if it was for free speech, it would do it. But that whole attitude is an anti-free speech attitude. Free speech is recognizing that you have the right to say what you want, to listen to what you want to listen to exclude from your forums things that you don't think belong there and include things you do think belong there. And it's that whole thing that's the right. And so even when people don't take free speech in this exclusive way because it's justified on the social good, therefore I don't have to extend it to her. Even when they think, yeah, you have to extend it to everyone, they think everybody is obligated to, in their own time and their own property, platform everyone. And they're not. That is a violation of the idea of free speech, not an application of it.
So I wanted to give John Stuart Mill his due, and he's come up, and you've criticized him, and sort of by implication, you've described sort of a utilitarian perspective. I wonder if you can give us sort of an encapsulation of what is the Millian position, as it's been already put on the table, and then how do you distinguish your position from it, just in very succinct form.
Well, see, I've been talking for a while now, so maybe someone else.
So maybe I'll turn to you, Onkar. Just sort of how would you summarize sort of, this is how people think of it in Millian terms, here's how I think of it.
Well, one way that I think of it, and this relates to the contrast to Ayn Rand, on liberty is, there's a focus on the individual, in some ways an innovator, the person who thinks outside of the box, who will challenge conventions and traditions. But so the collectivist perspective is, yeah, society could control him, society could ban him, it could even kill him in a certain sense. But it would be unwise for it to do so. And so it's a kind of plea and a begging of a permission to live because, look, my living will benefit you. And it's such a radical non-individual, from a moral perspective. And Mill's a utilitarian, so he's not an individualist morally. So there's a way in which I think Mill personally respects individuals and individuals who are willing to buck the trend and so on. But his view is, but of course society can control these people, but here's an argument why you should give them, that you should let the leash loose, you should be loose on the leash. And that is the beginning of the end for individualism. If you're going to concede that, that you don't really believe in freedom, because freedom means freedom for the individual to act and to think and to live. And that is, on liberty is begging permission. And if you contrast this to, say, Ayn Rand and the Fountainhead, which is her paean to individualism, it's Howard Rourke, the hero of the novel. One of the things he says, I don't recognize, it's more eloquent than this, I can't remember exactly the line, but I don't recognize this kind of social control over my life, that my life belongs to the collective and they get to decide what is done and whether I get permission to exist or not. And that's the individualist perspective. And it's rare that anybody articulates that now from a moral perspective. And Ayn Rand's the great champion of the individual, much, much more deeply than Mill is.
Can I say a little more on that, on Mill? If you read Mill, if you haven't already, and if you read the relevant portions of On Liberty on Mill, by Mill, he makes some great arguments in a certain respect for free speech. And I teach it sometimes, and when I've gone a few years without reading it, and I reread it, it's like, man, he's so right in these. He's so right in these. But what he's so right about, in my view, is he gets right the tremendous practical benefits of the free exchange of ideas. But what he gets so wrong is that your life is yours, regardless of your contribution to society. So in a way, I'm just circling back to the theme I hit upon earlier, but he is a utilitarian. At the end of the day, he makes that very clear. If you don't know much about Mill, he wrote On Liberty and he wrote Utilitarianism, and it's the utilitarianism and the social good that is all important. So he doesn't have the individualist perspective, but contemporary champions of free speech, and there are many who, at least in lip service, and I think with a lot of sincerity, mean to be defending freedom of speech around the world. They're mostly Millians. And Mill gives you all these great practical arguments of a certain, practical of a certain sort as ammunition, but the individualism is missing, and therefore, well, when that speech is not going to be conducive to what the relevant parties deem the social good in some way or progress, be it restrictions on hate speech or what have you, then your speech is out of luck, even if your speech wasn't infringing on anybody else's rights.
He's also, though, missing a large part of what the freedom is for, and the method by which being free to speak and being free to make your own choices about content, right, leads to the benefits it does, even practically. So he's unaware, for example, of the role that, like, he's associated with the phrase a marketplace of ideas. But a marketplace isn't a place where everybody takes and gives all the same things, right? A marketplace is a place where different shops have different products and they don't sell everything. And like, if you're for free trade, that doesn't mean if you own a store, you should sell every product in your store. And you're not against free trade because you don't sell guns or something in your store. You're just, you don't want to sell guns. You want to sell this other thing instead. And you don't want to sell, you know, pornography or this kind of magazine or that. You choose what you sell in your store. That doesn't make you less free trade. It's an exercise of free trade to make decisions about which wares you're going to carry and so forth. And likewise, it's an exercise of free speech to set up forums and decide what things you're going to have in them and not. And by missing that, I think Mill misses a lot of the practical benefits of free speech, as well as missing the deepest issues of it, even though he's very eloquent on some of those benefits and parts of the mechanism by which it's beneficial. I just want to add one other thing, because we've contrasted Mill and Rand, but they're not the only two players here. And part of why I'm so down on Mill on this is that he represents a turn to the worse. There's a pre-existing tradition of Locke and especially of Jefferson and Madison that established a high watermark in human thought, particularly Jefferson and Madison, on the freedom of speech. And there's an issue in American jurisprudence on free speech. There's one strand that's flowing from these guys, from particularly Madison and Jefferson, and there's one strand, and this American strand on First Amendment jurisprudence has a major influence around the world in thinking about free speech. And then there's another strand in thinking around the world on free speech, and you can find both of these in almost every person who writes on this, particularly people who have a legal background. And the other strand is this Millian strand. And I think Mill injected something bad into a good tradition, and is that it undermines it and saps a lot of its power. And if you want to see Rand's role here, I think it's kind of reinvigorating and giving clarity to what was good about the tradition prior to Mill.
Can I just mention, I have an essay in the collection on religious freedom, but it talks about the Lockean tradition, and because again, since I think that the real issue is intellectual freedom, and that's what undergirds religious freedom or speech freedom, you might, if you're interested in pursuing that Lockean perspective that Jefferson and Madison picked up on, the essay on religious freedom, the one that refers to Locke in the title, I think would be helpful.
I'd like to turn to audience questions in a little while, but to stimulate that, I want to put on the table some of the views that you guys have either written about in the book or have presented in other forums. And I'm going to list a few things and just ask you for a little elaboration on what you think of this, and hopefully this is stimulating for you guys. So we've heard from you all that you see intellectual freedom as important because we each need to think and run our own lives and grow our knowledge and navigate the world. And so I think it will be surprising for people to hear that you're all staunch opponents of public education. And the reason I think that's a tension is, or it might seem as a tension for people, shouldn't everyone be educated? Shouldn't they be able to learn and grow their knowledge? And isn't that a value? And what I've heard from you in other contexts is, in fact, it's a gross violation of intellectual freedom to have the state involved in education. So that's one issue, and I'll come back to one more here. Protests. So in the text of the First Amendment, there is, let me just find it here, there's the right to peaceably assemble and to petition the government for redress of grievances. And you, Onkar, have given a talk here at UT Austin some years back on the right to protest. And one of the things that comes out of your presentation is that most people misunderstand what that really means. And the right to protest is not, in fact, as expansive, or it's just misunderstood. So if I understand your position, most of the protests that we see, like clogging up the Golden Gate Bridge or an encampment at Columbia, private university, you would regard that as, in fact, not an exercise, but a violation of intellectual freedom. And one other, just to add to the spice of the sort of the controversy I hope is coming out, government grants for research. So most universities, a big source of their revenue is research that is funded by various government organizations. And I've heard in different settings that each of you regards that as, in fact, a violation of intellectual freedom, and in many cases it redounds to free speech. Do you want to elaborate on any of those? And then we can turn to some of the other topics. But so, Onkar, tell us a bit about your perspective on protest.
Oh, I was going to talk about education.
Okay, let's start with
Yeah, I
education.
want that education
But you can
too.
do protest in a minute.
Because part of the sort of context or tone of the question was, how can you value education and be against public education? But my view is I value education. That's why I'm against public education. Just as I value trade. So I'm for free trade and against government controlling trade and telling people what you have to do and what you can and can't trade. So that is the destruction of trade. And I think it's the same, it's the destruction of education. That education, the pursuit of knowledge, and then how to pass knowledge down from generation to generation, the value of that, how to do it, what should be done, at what age. It's a complex endeavor that we could get better and better at of learning how to do this. But what you need in order to do that is you need the freedom for people to think about this, to figure out the value of education in their lives. Why is it that education, like the first 25 years you do education, then you do work? Why is there not more of a blend between these things? If you look in the 17th, 18th century, people leave school at 12 and go work. But it's not like then education stops. If you look at some of it's a complex problem. It's deeply important. There's a tremendous opportunity to innovation. And what government controls does is imposes a monopoly or a quasi-monopoly. This is how it's going to be done. This is how much money we're going to spend on it. This is when you're going to be educated, and we're going to compel you to go to school now. All of that it's destructive in the same way that when we think of, the Soviet Union trying to control trade, imposes all these controls, like this is how you're going to do it, and people can get, you can't even produce shoes if you do this. And the same is true in education if you give government this kind of power. Now there's more to it. There's a real restriction so the kind of argument that was made about the separation of church, that it's a violation of your religious freedom if your own religion is persecuted, treated as second class in the nation, but it's also a violation of your intellectual freedom or religious freedom if they take your money and fund other people. And all public education means they take your money and fund schools and things that you might not agree with, you might think it can be done better and so on, and you don't have any freedom to do that. So it's such a massive violation of rights, and anybody who really genuinely cares about education and understands the way in which government controls destroys it has to be against public education.
To be free in an area of life is to be able to conduct that area of life according to your own judgment, associating with other people when and in the ways that you judge will further your aims in this area, and disassociating them from them when you think being associated with them would hamper your aims in this area. Working together on projects by mutual consent and mutual understanding, and not working together where you don't think there's a way to accomplish what we want together here. But to have something be public education, publicly supported research, is precisely not to have that. Public education is putting us all together to all be educated together in accordance with standards voted on by all of us together in places that our kids are all taken to together. And if I want to do it, I think this is the best kind of education, and you think that's the best kind of education, and he's a skeptic of education at all and thinks people should be unschooled or whatever. All of our kids get taken and put into the same place. And all of our money gets taken to fund it. And there's precisely not this kind of independence to choose for yourself by your own judgment how to conduct this area of your life. Likewise, research. If I think a certain kind of research is really promising and there are things to be learned in it, and you think that you're barking up the wrong tree and so forth, well, now we have to vote for people and get together, and some decision has to be made for both of us about how research is going to get conducted. I can't put my money to one thing and you to another, and if you're somebody who's seeking to do a kind of research, you can go around and find someone who thinks it's a good idea to pay you. No, we all have to go to the NEH or some national committee or whatever that's taken all of the money that would be in the culture for research, it's kind of nationalized it, and now it's going to dole it out in accordance with whatever kind of common denominator standards we could all agree with. That, or the people with the largest pressure group could get imposed on everybody. That is the opposite of freedom in the field. Freedom is individualism. Freedom is each person being able to go his own way by his own judgment. And so collectivizing things is making them unfree.
Can I just add a little bit? Because there's a lot of stuff to pick up on there, but just a little bit. I think we tend to think of censorship, when you first hear that term censorship, as shutting somebody up. right? It's some form of muzzling, like we silence you. We literally shut you up, we put you in jail, we break your printing press, we physically keep you from speaking. But I think what's coming out here is government subsidies, be it for research or for education of this sort or that sort or whatever. Government spending, government support of certain speech is also a violation of individuals' rights, right? If censorship is essentially government restriction of rightful speech, of the kind of speech that people are entitled to engage in, right? Government restriction of rightful speech, well, you're imposing those restrictions when you take your tax dollars to fund this kind of education and so on. So it's not as obvious, it's not as apparent. I only got this a few years ago. I think I got it from Encore, right? But it's like, oh yeah, that's also a form of government manipulation of thou shalt know this, right? What's the curriculum that's going to pass as a good enough public school curriculum such that, okay, you passed 4th grade, you passed 5th grade, right? The government will decide. So we talk these days a lot about misinformation and disinformation, and when the remedies, some of the remedies that people propose are, well, then we should have the government regulate, and keep us safe from misinformation. So we should have government information. We should have the government-approved information be the information that we get. One of my favorite lines about free speech, I quote in one of the articles, it's from Justice Robert Jackson, and I will butcher this quote, but it's not for the government to tell us what shall be orthodox. In matters of religion, matters of politics, matters of any, it is not for the government. We'll figure that out, what we think is right or wrong or true or false.
And even more strongly, I'd say, I'll figure it out. Because the government, in a certain sense, is us. It's not this alien thing that comes and imposes us. It's you guys. You guys vote, and I vote too. And if you vote for the guy who thinks this is orthodox, and now I got to be told this, and I can't preach the other thing. To have government control things means to have your neighbors control things. It means that it's up to them, or the consensus among them, what you get to say, how you get to educate your kids, not up to you. What research you could pursue, and so forth. It's not that the government is this alien thing from us, the people, and we're good and they're bad. The government is some amalgam of us. It's the collective rather than the individuals, right? It's us yoked together in a kind of three-legged race, or however many legs you have if you add everybody together, and stumbling all over and tripping and nobody able to go his own way, as opposed to people strolling together cooperatively and on their own when they don't want to be with one another.
Well, I have a lot more questions, and I will ask them, but I'd want to open this up to get questions from you in the audience about what we've talked about, applications. There have been a number of things in the news. So you're welcome to raise your hands. And yes, in the back. Why don't we start with you?
Hi, I'm Monica. I guess just about the public education point, I would say, so say we all agree that it is bad and we want to implement this into our society and funding. How do you see this working? Do you see this working as a patchwork of homeschooling, private solutions? And what would you say could happen to the kids who would, fall through the cracks, whose parents were not able to give them the education they might want, or who could not afford private school tuition?
Well, very few people can afford private school tuition now when they have to pay for it on top of paying for the public schools. And most people would be able to afford it if they didn't also have to pay for the public schools. It's not that regular people aren't paying for education now. They're just paying for it all tied to one another in a common pot rather than paying for it separately. I think ultimately education should be a good of a service provided like any other. Under freedom, people would evolve all different kinds of schools. Some would have home schools, and some would have big chain schools, and some would have pods, and some would do it all on the internet. And I think we're deprived from knowing all the different options there are for how best to educate people by the fact that people haven't been free to do this for quite a long time. If you think about what would be a step towards it, how would you get there? I think the main things are taking the money that's already taken from us to fund education and putting it in the hands of individual parents. And I think the best form of doing that is giving tax credits for education. This is a proposal that Rand endorsed, a little bit different than the voucher proposals that are more common. But the idea, I think, basically would be a law that says that you could subtract from your tax to any municipality that you pay taxes from, any money that you spend educating somebody, and maybe up to a certain amount per person. And if that were the case, any parent would be able to take their kid and use that money to pay for him in any kind of educational environment he wanted. And any other person who didn't have kids would be able to donate the money up to that amount to a school of his choice that he thought was good, or to a particular student, or whatever it would be. And I think ultimately we should just get government out of this area of the society altogether. There wouldn't be taxes collected and so forth. And I think there are all kinds of ways to make education affordable. Most content that people consume of any sort right now is free at the point of use, funded either by advertising or information harvesting or something else. And this, I think, is a fantastic thing. And given that this is true and has been true for a long time about a lot of print media, about broadcast media, there's no reason to think it couldn't be true of educational media as well. Or that educational media provided like that wouldn't be better or couldn't be better than what we have now, which isn't very good. But I think as a means of transition, the tax credits idea would be how to do it.
So hand up there, Miss.
Free speech as an individual right, meaning that people are not obligated to platform every voice or agree with every voice. How does this apply to institutions like universities?
Well, I think we have to distinguish, I'll just say this first and then let the other panelists, public universities, the very existence of which runs afoul of free speech, I think. Given that they exist, and here we are all at one, you can think about how do we deal with them. But public institutions and private ones. And I think in the case of private ones, it's just not an issue of free speech. It's an issue of what business model is this university on, and what's their mission, and what are they trying to accomplish. And I write about this a fair amount in the book, incidentally, and different ones will have different things, and you can think about what's a better or worse educational product, but it's not an issue of free speech. And for public ones, I think they have to be as neutral and open as possible, given that they're public institutions.
So just to add a little bit to that. Just to elaborate really on what you were saying quickly, with the private, a school has to figure out, we're going to be a school for X, for this, maybe our mission is religious. Maybe it's we want to promote good Baptists or good Catholics or whatever, and that is our paramount mission, and education of certain sorts is secondary to that. No, maybe we have a, whatever, it needn't be religious, it could be secular, it could be political, it could be economic, but what are you all about? Make clear what you're all about, and adopt your policies about what you will and won't tolerate. And everybody, ideally, everybody would know what they're getting into, and what kind of faculty you're going to be teaching the courses and so on, because you could have some very doctrinaire things. So you'd need to educate yourself about what's going to be offered here. Yeah, public universities, insofar as they're taking state money, government money, they've got to be more open according to the First Amendment. Now, there are further arguments to be had, and again, I think this is one of the really valuable things about the essay that Greg wrote in the piece, because he talks about academic freedom somewhat, and there are all sorts of reasons why, apart from freedom of speech in the legal sense, right? You should have the right to say what you want. There are good reasons to have policies at different kinds of universities, at different kinds of corporations, other institutions, to have more or less openness about the kind of speech that is encouraged, genuinely encouraged in those places. But that's more an issue of what kind of policies are best going to serve the ends of this organization. And being a big believer in the power of ideas and the power of let's argue about them, let's make enemies in the sense of you won't like everything we say today, but let's talk and think that's the better way for everybody, me included, to get the best ideas in the end. I forget how I began that sentence, but I think you get the idea. At least you're nodding very politely, which I appreciate.
Okay. Yeah, I want to just say, so we said earlier that, or I think, Greg, you said there's two traditions, a Lockean Madison-Jefferson tradition about intellectual freedom, and then the Millian, which comes later and I think is alien. And that Ayn Rand is taking the Lockean Madison-Jefferson seriously, thinking of its philosophical foundations and what it means to be consistent with those philosophical foundations. Public education and then public universities is one element of that that's very important. So Jefferson is for some kind of public education. I think that's an incredibly deep inconsistency with his broader advocacy of intellectual freedom. And Ayn Rand sees it as such. And the arguments that work for that the establishment of a church is a violation of people's intellectual freedom is what you can think of as a public university is the establishment of a certain perspective on education. And the fact that, so an established church doesn't mean every other religion now is prohibited, we're going to drive you out of town. It just means we've selected one, this one's really the true one, and we're going to put public funds there, we're going to tax people and so on. So yeah, you're still free to practice your religion. And they understood, no, we're not free to do that. If you're taking our money to subsidize this, and you're saying this is the established church, that's a violation of our intellectual freedom. And it doesn't change if what you're subsidizing is not a church but a university. And what we're doing is not religious education, we're doing secular education. The same argument works, that this is a violation of everyone's intellectual freedom. And if that were grasped, then it would be, yeah, okay, we shouldn't have public universities, and then there'll be a question of like how to transition out of that, but people would understand, yeah, the end point is that we have to transition out of it. And so that's the argument that has to be understood and has to win.
And the way people think of private universities today is assuming that the public university premise is proper and moral. There's some right way to run an institution of higher learning that's totally neutral on what things you think is true, what methods you think are right, what things, maybe it's the way the University of Chicago does it, or the way Texas does it, or there's some one right way to run a university that you could know is the right way and the right policy about who you'll hire and what conversations you'll have and which ones you won't. It doesn't require any particular values or any particular philosophy or any particular view of what's true. You just somehow, we all know this. And then that's how universities should be. And we could disagree about everything somehow within the context of this, except this thing that underlies the whole thing. That's a contradiction. You can't have that. You need the political freedom to have people with different views about what speech is in and out of bounds, what ideas are worth considering and not worth considering, on what terms people who really disagree with one another should teach students together and so forth. And there are different solutions to those problems based on different educational philosophies, different other kinds of philosophies, and that's why there need to be different universities with different views.
Let's go over here.
I'm wondering if you can say a little bit more about what the role of speech is in human life and why speech is such an important thing that we need to protect, and especially if the justification for free speech comes ultimately from an individualistic, self-interested perspective. Why is speech so important? Because speech is inherently social.
Freedom is also inherently social in a way, right? It's the condition of in society being able to deal with people only voluntarily and not having them able to be forcing themselves upon you. And then that means dealing with people by consent, only when it's been communicated between the two of you that this dealing is welcome. It's about being able to reason with other people as opposed to treating them and being treated by them as merely an object to be interacted with externally.
And about being able to reason, right? And I think that's even, it's in a way before the social comes in, but the social can be a great aid to my reasoning. But, so you'll recall at the very beginning today I was saying something about it's intellectual freedom. So it's not that speech per se, or hearing, the vocal, and so on, the audible is what's so important, but it's the freedom to think, right? Speech is a great, if I can hear what you have to say, especially if you're a relatively intelligent person speaking, on bringing up germane considerations and so on, I might have a lot to learn from you. I might personally, selfishly have a lot to learn from you, about the things I'm overlooking, the things I'm not getting right. You might give me ideas for how to build further. So it's, on Rand's view, reason is man's means of survival. This is how this is why we're eating the barbecue tonight and the Longhorn isn't eating us, right? Because they've got a lot on us, physically, right? And God bless Bevo and come back this week. Okay, but there is a reason why, he's on our plate and it's our minds. Our mind, the mind is the meal ticket. But you need freedom of the mind so that you can figure out, how do we get him here? How do I get nice air conditioning when it's 90 degrees outside, or what have you? I mean, all sorts of things. It's the mind that does it, reason. The mind needs to be free so that it could explore what other people have to say, so that it could observe. It could go look. It could go pray to that God if it wants to pray to that God for a while until it figures out, oh, that God, nobody's home. At any rate, I'm losing my point here.
Did you want to add to this, Omkar?
Yeah, just so it's natural to think of speech in a collective or social context, but there is such a thing as speaking to yourself. If you think of authoritarian governments, what their deepest target is, it's the individual thinking for themselves. And they're not just, oh, you can do whatever, like the Chinese government, it's not, or the North Korean government, you can do whatever you want as long as you're just doing it by yourself. But if you're going to speak with other people, we're going to control that. No, the ultimate object of control is we want to control what you think. And it's an individual target. And if you want a fictional example of this, in Ayn Rand's Anthem, it starts off, it is a sin to write this. And he's just keeping a diary to himself. And in a way you can think he's speaking to himself. And that is what they want to control, because it's a danger to them. If a person can think for themselves and figure out, yeah, what this whole regime is wrong and it's evil, that's like, why do they want to control it? They want to control the individual. And controlling speech is an element of controlling the individual.
So I want to take your question and then bring it back. So let's take your question and yours.
I guess I just wanted to ask more so to get a clearer version of what removing public education will look like. You said to go ahead and place the financial responsibility and liberty on the parents, but where does that leave orphans and children in foster care if you eliminate public education as a whole?
Well, education isn't different from any of the other things that children need to live and to survive, right? So if you have orphans or children in foster care, they need shoes, they need shelter, they need food, and they need education. And we don't have, the public restaurant, the public shoe store, or shoe dispensary, or whatever. Now, we might have public programs that provide these as charities, or they might be done through private charities, but we don't have a system that gives everyone its shoes, and we think we need this because there are some orphans who nobody else is there to give them their shoes. So I think we should think of orphans or children in foster care, educating them the way we think of providing them with any other values. And then there's a question as to how does that get handled? Is it handled through private charity? Is it handled through a governmental agency? Is it handled through an agency that places, like family courts, that then place children in either foster homes or in private homes? But I think that whatever the right answer to it is, it's the right answer to it for the case of all these other values. And there's no reason to make the provision of any of these values to everyone in the society turn on how it gets handled in this very small minority of cases where people don't have parents.
Take it very back, yes.
I have two quick questions, one at the level of state, one at the level of the family. As far as the state goes, for free speech absolutism to flourish, do you think any form of social contract is possible? Like, is it taxation inherently antithetical to free speech absolutism, democracy included? And at the level of the family, how do you guys look at child rearing then? Isn't child rearing also at certain parts fundamentally antithetical to free speech absolutism? And do those arguments like feed into this whole concept of antinatalism that it's just don't have kids?
I'm not following the second part about...
Let's take the first question first, and then we'll come back. So the first question, if I'm going to just read it back to you, is about free speech absolutism, as you put it, in a social context. Is that antithetical with democracy? Is that
Yes,
right?
any sort of social contract.
Okay, so do you want to take that one?
Okay.
Yeah.
I would ask, what do you mean by a social contract? But if it's not incompatible with a society that respects individual rights. So individual rights it's not right to think of it as a social contract that we sort of all haggle about what the rules are of proper social organization, what the fundamental rules of proper social organization are definable. And the whole idea of the principle of individual rights is they define at a fundamental level. If you're going to have a society in which the individual, if he so chooses, can pursue his life and happiness, then he needs the rights to life, liberty, property, and the pursuit of happiness. And that, I think, is demonstrable. And so what you're trying to get is agreement with those principles. It's not a contract where we're haggling about. What you're trying to get is people's understanding. And you can get, and the creation of the United States, I think, is proof of, you can get sufficient agreement that these principles are right. And that doesn't mean 100% agreement, but sufficient agreement from the leaders, or who will become leaders in society, that this is the proper society to create, and then take the steps in order to create that. And the Declaration of Independence and the US Constitution are that creation, given there's great inconsistency. It was like it had to be perfected in that sense, but the principles are right. They were inconsistently applied, but that's what I think of as the creation of a free society. And do I think you can get that? Yes, you can get the understanding that these principles are true, because I think the principles are true.
And if you respect the principles of individual freedom, individual rights to freedom, that constrains the democracy that you will have. That is, you will go by democratic will only up to the point of that respecting, as long as that continues to respect the individual rights. So it's incompatible with the kind of, well, a majority wants this, so you're out of luck, whether it be concerning what you speak, what you say, or in regard to trade or anything else.
Okay. Yes. Yes.
Is it a logical extension of this principle, and is it worthwhile to point out that any regulation concerning licensure, like who your barber is or who your engineer is designing your bridge, or zoning, is also a violation of this principle?
Well, all licensures of business is a violation of the principle of rights and individualism and freedom. Whether it's specifically speech depends on whether the job is a speaking job, so to speak. So you could, I suppose, have a silent barber, but you can't have a silent tour guide or a silent engineer, so in that sense, I think, yeah, it is an issue of free speech. And the Institute for Justice has been starting to do a line of cases against licensing laws, particularly on this issue that they violate the First Amendment.
I just want to, I'm not sure that all licensing is necessarily wrong. I'm not sure, okay? But I do, like the occupational speech license, it's not exactly the same issue, but there's a lot of licensing that I think is completely incompatible, a lot of government mandated licensing that I think is incompatible with respect for individual freedom. The reason why I have this little asterisk is, but might there be some activities that are by their nature so inherently dangerous that you'd need you'd need assurance that a certain level of care has been taken before that person is permitted to do that? I'd want to think more about that and hear intelligent thought about that, right? But, and some of this comes back to the issue of, that Anko was talking about earlier, how our judicial practice, our courts, have gotten into the habit now for generations of, we respect some kinds of speech a lot more than others. So political speech, high respect relatively. Religious speech, high respect. Commercial speech, occupational speech, and an awful lot of how we're less a manufacturing country today, right? The economy, it's much more information and so on. So much of what so many of us do, like college professors, right? We speak for a living. Lawyers give advice. Doctors give counsel. They don't just knock on your knees and so on, right? There are a lot of restrictions and licenses about some of those sorts of things that, yes, they are, I think, completely incompatible with respect for individual rights.
And I'd say more widely, and this might be part of what you're asking, many economic controls are violations of intellectual freedom. So maybe not speech in particular, but they're targeted at, we don't like what you're doing because we disagree with it. Like, we have different ideas, we have a different viewpoint. We don't like that Facebook might promote the Hunter Biden laptop story. This is what Zuckerberg said he got pressure from. So we want to tell you not to do this. That's an economic control, but to distinguish that from, well, but isn't this an infringement on their intellectual freedom? Yeah, it's targeting the economic practice because of the thought behind the practice. We don't agree with these thoughts. We don't think this is a legitimate story, so you should suppress it. And if you're not suppressing it, well, we're going to put pressure on you to. So that's an interference. It's an interference with their economic freedom to run their company, but it's also an interference with their intellectual freedom. And in that case, it's also speech, but there's many controls. What the target is we disagree with what you're thinking and therefore how you're acting. And so we want to control and to stop you from doing this. And that's stopping them from acting on their thoughts.
And any kind of control, as opposed to law respecting and implementing rights, is doing that. That is, it's saying, we disagree with your judgment of what you want to do, and so we're not going to let you do it.
In the red?
This is directed more towards on-guard, as you mentioned it earlier. You said a lot of people misunderstand what the right to peacefully protest actually entails, and that we've mostly just been abusing it. You also specifically mentioned how the encampments were a violation. So can you broadly go over what peaceful assembly, like what freedoms of peaceful assembly we actually have, and if you want to break down how the encampments were a violation as well?
So I think what peaceful assembly means, and the peaceful is important there, that it has a meaning. I think the primary, then we can introduce a complication. The primary means that you're assembling on your own property, or somebody who's agreeing to host you, to have you there, versus you're occupying somebody's factory, somebody's university, somebody's place of business, and saying, well, but I've got something to say, and I want to protest. So, yeah, but you're interfering with their with their private property. So what peaceful assembly means is that you have a right to be there. And the only place you have a right to be is on your own property, or if you're on someone else's property, to be there by their consent and agreement. And if you're not, then you're violating their rights. And so much of what counts as protest today is on other people's property. Yeah, so that's the complication. So you might think in the writing of the First Amendment, which is happening in the 18th century, that to petition the government for grievances might mean that there's a kind of public square in which you can go, you can assemble, and peacefully protest some government policy and so on. And I don't think that's needed. Certainly in the modern world, it's not. You don't need some square in front of town hall where people can come and have a petition the government for grievances. There's all kinds of other mechanisms in which you can do that, including what people do is they get these documents with hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of signatures and send it to the government. So there's all kinds of ways, I think, in which you can petition the government for grievances without the government having a public square where people can come and assemble. If you have a public square, it has to be administered in a way that is content neutral. It can't be the people who have the loudest voice get to go there, or the biggest crowd that gets to. It's not a majority issue. If it's an individual right, every individual has it. It would be very complicated in the modern world to run a public square, which I think is one of the reasons not to have one. Public property like bridges, roads, parks. There's a question. And in the end, I think the answer to the question is, so there's a question, should these exist as public spaces? I think in the end, no. It should be private roads, private parks. But if they exist for a certain reason. Roads exist for people to get from point A to point B. And you can't just go on a road and say, no, I'm stopping everybody from getting from point A to point B because I've got something to say. Any more than you could go down and sleep on a private road because, look, I'm tired and I don't feel like going home. I'm really tired, so I'm just going to sleep on the public road. Nobody can get by? Yeah, okay, nobody can get by, but I'm tired. You can't do that, and you can't do it if instead of saying you're tired, you're saying, well, I've got something I really want to get off my chest, so I've got to be able to do this. No, you don't have to. I don't think anyone has a right to use the public roads and public parks in this kind of way. and no one, like nobody has it. So that's part of my view of and what has blurred it is going from, yeah, maybe you have a public square, which meant like people can assemble and you're in front of the government building and you can talk to them and say, these are my grievances and so on, to parks and roads and so on that anybody can go and scream their head off. And I don't
And
think
even,
there's.
just to add a little bit, even with when there is a public square or a part of a public university where people can protest or what have you, and this came up if any of you were at the law school panel on at lunchtime on free speech a few days ago, shared space requires a certain kind of governance of it with consistency and neutrality such that so like let's say one student group, you don't get to monopolize, let's say there's an area on the mall or wherever it might be at UT, right? But let's say there are certain areas where students are allowed to protest. That doesn't mean first group that gets there, they can protest indefinitely, they can just sort of colonize that for 2 weeks or whatever. So there time, place, manner restrictions in the use of public space or shared space in this kind of case, I think also has to come into it.
There are a few layers of questions. One, once we do have this public property that we're using this way, one is, should we have it?
Right.
Two is, okay, given that we now have it, whether we should or not, what would be the best or least bad set of rules to have for it? And then two, how do we enforce them? So like, in fact, in Texas now, the non-building space on the university is legally mandated to be places where people can come and speak and say whatever they like. And there are some rules for how that is to be handled that are, some of them in state law and some of them are university policies. And then given that all that is the case, it would then be a violation of the First Amendment if it's getting enforced, if you're pro-Zionist versus you're anti-Zionist, if you're pro-Greg Abbott versus you're anti-Gro Abbott or whatever it is, if it's then enforced differently, that then would be a violation of the First Amendment. But it's very hard to enforce these things neutrally, which is one reason, and there's a kind of pretense, I think, that it can really be enforced neutrally, which I think is again a reason not to take land that the government owns and runs and is supporting with everyone's tax dollars and using it for this purpose. People can rent stadiums, they can do other things to have rallies.
Yeah.
Yes, what are your thoughts then, thinking of content neutrality, of universities, public universities, telling student groups, yeah, you can bring your controversial speaker, and sometimes it's like Ann Coulter or somebody who's not terribly controversial, but you have to pay the extra $10,000 in police protection. To me, that's something of a kind of a monetary heckler's veto or canceling, but maybe that's what makes it so complex. You've got a public university, and yet, if you want to bring a controversial speaker, since there's so many shutdowns today, so many, heckler's vetoes, so what should be, how should we look at those situations?
So there's a number of considerations. So we've actually had that. So we did, in post 9/11 and then the Danish cartoon crisis, we at the Ayn Rand Institute did a number of campus events which there's threats of violence or death accompanying them. I actually bought a bulletproof vest because I was around the Danish cartoon crisis because we were doing events and we were displaying the cartoons, and there were real threats. So one is that there's a government function, and the idea of I don't quite understand the issue of campus police and how they've come about, and sort of the university runs these things. I don't think that should exist. So I'm just going to talk about police, and we contacted the police in various areas. It's, I think, an obligation, but I'll qualify it, an obligation of the police that if citizens are being threatened, that you're trying to protect the citizens. But on the other hand, the police have limited resources, and so they have to figure out like how credible is this threat, and given all the other things we have to do, are we going to send an officer to this event and so on? And we had, Alon's done something, we've had officers at events, and we've had screening of the people coming into the event. And that's a government function when the threat is really a credible threat and they have the resources given everything else that is going on. to address that threat. You can have additional security, and we've had at some events additional security, which is not a government function. And there it's the private individuals have to pay for it. But if you have a university that's like taking this seriously, and if they say, like, our policy is, when we think there's real threats, we're going to provide additional security, they should do that. And if they've said, like, they're going to do it in a content neutral way, we don't care what the event is, but if there's credible threats here, we're going to provide additional security. They should provide it for everybody, not on a selective basis. But a private university could have that. There's some selectivity going on. So I would distinguish between those two. Like, private additional security is something that you have to pay for. But the basic that the government is there to protect you from force and violence, and if there's real credible threat, and there were for some of our events, and given some of the people we had, like we had the publisher of the Danish cartoons in some of the events, they were credible threats. And there the government it's their responsibility in protecting the rights of the citizens to protect those people. But again, that's contextual. You can't just demand, there's limited resources, so you can't just demand it in a vacuum, but it's a real issue for government.
There's also a real issue of what it means for private individuals to stand up for free speech. So if someone's saying something that you think is loathsome and awful, I don't think it's standing up for free speech to say, in fact, right on, that guy's a real free speech champion because other people don't want to hear what he has to say, so like, it's awesome he's so bold to say it. That is not standing up for free speech, that's standing up for no standards. But if somebody's trying to shoot him for saying it, standing up for free speech is saying, no, people can't be shot for saying these things. People can't be heckled, vetoed out by violence for saying these things. And I'm willing to volunteer, put up money, put up resources to stop the violence. And I think that if you're in a situation where there's a credible threat of violence to the people expressing a viewpoint that you don't agree with, you agree with it or not, it doesn't matter. Like, someone wants to say something and people want to kill them, shoot them, attack them, and there aren't enough resources to fund the defense of that. You're defending your own rights, you're defending your society when you stand up and say, well, I'll chip in some money to get some extra security there, or I'll come and volunteer to do security there to protect this person's ability to say it from the people who want to kill, hurt, maim him. That's very different from platforming someone, which I think is it's a very different kind of thing.
I just want to add, I'll take your questions in just a second. So I think one of the cases I remember, which I think goes to your question as just an added feature, which is cases of selective refusal to provide security as a cop-out. And it's often, in the experiences I've had, it's because there's some other group on campus that's pressuring the administration. The administration doesn't want to say we can't have the event, so the way they cancel the event is by saying you now need to pay by tomorrow $50,000, which is not a realistic scenario for most student groups, even if someone says I'll chip in. So it becomes a heckler's veto, and it also reflects cowardice by administrators, because there are better ways to handle a situation like that than to
you get things like this across the ideological spectrum.
Yeah.
So you talked about cases where ARI was, had something that was offensive or thought of as offensive to some Muslims or people of a certain people. But you also get the same thing with UCLA, I think it was, had one of its valedictorians was
USC.
somebody, USC, it was very much in favor of the Palestinian cause or some version of it, and had some social media posts and so forth. And then there was a sense that the commencement might be in danger in some way, and she was disinvited. And if the school had said, we don't agree with her politics and we don't want her to be that would be one thing, but they weren't saying that, right? They were saying, we think other people might disagree and we're afraid, and it was, I think, transparently an excuse to not have somebody that was going to be controversial and some of their donors would dislike or whatever it was.
Let's take some more questions, Miss.
I just wanted to throw back to the orphanage question, because I think that it sounds a little contradictory, like to some of your solutions for government funding whenever everything was taking the money of the people and putting it into something that you might not be like interested in. So like one of your solutions was government funding to provide education for these orphanages, but if you're against like the government taking your money and putting it in something you're not for, how would that be like a solution for what you're...
To orphanages?
Yeah.
So the first issue is, I don't think the way we handle education in general should be determined by how it's handled for orphans. Just like the provisions of other goods and values and the way we handle it for orphans. Okay, how should then cases of orphans and the provision for orphans be handled generally? I think it should be handled privately and by private organizations, charities, etc. But I do think government has a role here in the following way. There's a question in the normal course of things. A child is born to some parents, and the parents are the parents of the child, and they're responsible for it, and they have certain obligations to it, and there's such a thing as child abuse and so forth, or neglect, and also, so, and governments are involved, there's such a thing as family courts in adjudicating kind of disputes around this. And just like there are jails that there have to be to arrest criminals, and there are police protective services to protect witnesses and so forth, there's the question of what happens to a child when, say, the parents are abusive and it has to be taken away from them. And I think what ought to happen is it's placed in another family privately that volunteers to do it, but just like the courts as part of defending people's rights and the police as part of defending people's rights has to have a jail to put people in and cop cars to drive around and to do it, part of the issue of defending people's rights is where do you have the kid for the while until we place it in another family? And I think it's just a kind of situation like that. So there's a kind of facilitating of the placing it in a family, and I think that's what orphanage is. Insofar as programs are run by the government, I think that's what they should be. But there is a function for the governments. Governments should exist and need to exist. Their function is to protect people's rights and to facilitate the protection of people's rights by putting the force that's used to do that in an objective, law-bound, and adjudicated by court system. And that involves spending money, right? And having people who are hired to do this and some resources to do it, and that's just part of what governments are for.
Yes.
I'm just curious to know if any of y'all would say Social Security is a violation of intellectual freedom.
It's a violation of freedom, but I think in some sense all freedom is intellectual. And so all freedoms are in a sense one. But insofar as you're going to distinguish types of freedom, intellectual freedom from economic freedom, I think Social Security, Medicare, etc., are what we normally call economic freedoms, or violations of what we normally call economic freedom.
But what's important, particularly for what we're emphasizing, is to understand why, to say it's an interference with your economic freedom, it means it's an interference with your thinking. So, and your judgment and your ability then to direct and plan your life. And Social Security is so much this. If I had an option of the government saying, okay, don't pay Social Security and you won't collect it at whatever age they decide I'm eligible to, I would do that for sure. I would say, yeah, don't tax me for it, and I can plan my own retirement, I can figure out my own investments, I can figure out the value of money to me now versus in the future. So there's a kind of projection that, well, everybody wants to do all these kinds of things in retirement. What about a person who thinks, for real reasons, yeah, like given my health and the history and so on, when I'm 70, I'm not going to be able to do much now. I'm using my money now. I don't need to save for this huge retirement and so on. That person's judgment is, no, you can't do that. Everybody is going to save this amount for your retirement at this age, and you can collect in this kind of way. And so I can't plan my retirement. I mean, my retirement, I figure I might get Social Security, but it probably will be close to bankrupt by the time, because the whole thing's a fraud in a different kind of way. But the fact is that I can't figure out and think my own retirement, or what I have to do is figure, yeah, I'm earning this money, but the government's taking it and so on. So thinking about my retirement, what I'm producing in this area is totally irrelevant. And it's such an interference with my ability to plan my life.
The government is telling you what shall be orthodox about how you will spend your senior years or whatever it is. Like, no, this is the orthodox amount that you should spend on this. And again, different individuals, for health reasons, as he mentioned, or just for lifestyle reasons. I want a life of adventure. I want a life of caution. I like, knowing there's money in the bank. I don't care so much about that. We all have different lifestyle preferences and so on, and what we anticipate our lives being like, in 20 years and 45 years or what have you, You don't get to decide that to the extent that, no, we're going to take this money from you and tell you how much should be saved and so on.
It's bizarre to think that a coal miner and a college professor, a coal miner who starts coal mining, say, right out of high school, versus a college professor who starts his profession, like 10 years or 15 years later. A coal miner whose job is tremendously physically grueling versus a college professor whose job is not physically demanding in the same way, right? Like these people should retire at the same age, and it would make sense to plan the whole economy around, well, they're 65. That is strange.
Aaron Rodgers is old. He's young, but he's old for quarterback. Yeah.
Okay, one last question, and then I want to come back to you and ask for some closing thoughts. Miss.
What do y'all think about defamation laws, since it's a bit of a regulation on completely free speech?
I think, so I referred just very quickly and fleetingly, but I do think some speech can infringe on others' rights. And genuine defamation, I think, is in that category. That is, there are forms of speeching that can infringe on others' rights. If I knowingly fraudulently misrepresent a product that I'm proposing to sell to you, okay? If I defame you such that, and now, defamation has to have a very definite definition, but it's not just I say your pizza stinks, right? But no, there are cockroaches and mice and vermin all over the kitchen in the, his pizza place or whatever and so on. And it does material damage. I'm in effect taking from you something that's yours, the reputation you've built up and the material interest in it. Perjury would be another sort of thing, genuine harassment or incitement. So, you have the right to say whatever you want up to the point of others' rights. And I do think that means that there are some sorts of speech that you shouldn't be free to engage in. But one thing I want to point out, First Amendment speaks of freedom of speech. It doesn't say Congress shall make no law abridging speech. It says abridging freedom of speech, which is referring to the fact that there is a range of freedom of speech, but it is not unlimited. And the fact that there are, and this is where I think a lot of people go wrong in misunderstanding things about whether or not free speech is absolute or whether there are exceptions. The fact that my rights only go so far as his rights, that's not an exception to my rights, right? That's a boundary. Just like my backyard. My backyard goes up to Steve's backyard, right? And there's a boundary of his property and my property and so on. That boundary is not an exception to my rights. So when we say, but you don't have the right to perjure or you don't have the right to fraudulently misrepresent, you see there are exceptions. No, that's a fundamental misconception. But I think it's an important one because when people think in terms of exceptions, then they think, you see, exceptions are acceptable. And, well, if we're going to infringe on your rights here, that's really OK. So one of my articles in the book, again, is about the misunderstanding of some of these terms, such as absolute and exceptions.
Can I? So in terms of thinking of it as it's a violation of rights, the way I think the clearest examples are it's a violation of property rights. And if you understand that there's such a thing as intellectual property, the interference with intellectual property can have intellectual means of interfering with it. And in speech in the context of intellectual property can be a violation of intellectual property. And that's the way. So it's from, they have a right to property, and defamation is an interference with that. Take an example first that's not kind of defamatory. That if somebody publishes a novel, and I now just republish it, can I say, well, I'm just speaking? Well, how are you going to? No, but you're violating the person's copyright. But you have to understand that copyright is it's intellectual property. And the way you can interfere with intellectual property is by intellectual means, including speaking. Like, no, you don't have a right to just republish the book because it's under copyright. For defamation, you're interfering, but this has to be carefully defined in law. You're interfering with intellectual property that's been created by the person. It will often be put as their reputation. It's easiest to see this in the corporate world. The example I give, because it's a real example, and you can project what the damages would be. I forget if this happened in the 80s or the 90s. Was for Tylenol, that somebody was putting cyanide in Tylenol capsules. And Tylenol was widely praised for what they did. They didn't have to do that. What they did, they withdrew all the product from everywhere. And we're going to, like, it wasn't a manufacturing defect. They weren't at fault at all. But someone like was maliciously put, we're going to withdraw everything. We're going to check everything. And they did this. They checked it all. They put it back then on the market and said, like, we've checked everything. And I don't think the person was tried, but they caught the person who they. If somebody said, oh, I had a capsule that had cyanide in it, that would have done, like after they've done all this, would have done tremendous damage to the company. And if the person did, like if they thought they had reason, I gave it to my pet and he died, and I thought, but if they're just doing it maliciously, it's such enormous damage to and that's a damage with their property. It destroys the value of the company. And that's what makes it, what you're doing is you're destroying the intellectual property that was created by, in this case, the company. And that's real damage, and the law should address that, I think.
And we do have one of our doctrines under IP law is, one, there are trade secrets. Like if I tell a trade secret, I'm just saying it, but I'm violating the property right of Coca-Cola if I, as an employee, learned their formula and I just blab it all over the place. But there's also trademarks. And if I, set myself up as I'm Coca-Cola and sell my own drink, right? That's, in effect, I'm using their reputation. And there are lots of examples of this. So just, I'm a fan of blues music. And if you ever talk about the harmonica player Sonny Boy Williamson, you have to say, do you mean the first or the second? Because there was a famous guy, Sonny Boy Williamson, famous for playing the harmonica. Somebody else just started saying, I'm Sonny Boy Williamson, and people were hiring him, and it turns out he was really good too, so now, but he was stealing, this guy's gigs and jobs and so forth by representing himself as it. And this kind of thing happens a lot. People try to steal one another's reputation in that way, and that's what trademark protects. And defamation is a kind of destruction of that kind of property as opposed to a kind of theft of it.
All right, we're not going to take any more questions. If you're here still afterwards and you want to come up and ask a question, if the speakers might be available to do that. So let me turn back to you each and ask you for some closing thoughts. So the theme of this event was free speech, what is it not? Any message you want to leave the audience with that's particularly important from your perspective, given what's come up today? Do you want us to come back to you in a minute? Are you ready to go?
I'll say something. We need to be careful about the word freedom. Freedom is the absence of what? And it's not simply the absence of being uncomfortable. We're made uncomfortable by things other people do, the way other people treat us, the things that other people say. That's not an infringement of your freedom to lead your life. That's living in the world. So we do need to be careful about what freedom is freedom from. A different just observation, we're talking a lot about, I should get to say what I want to say, and you should get to write what you want to write, and so on. But again, the value in the end of this free exchange of ideas and intellectual freedom is our using the material that we're exposed to, and even when we're talking to ourselves, to think and to think rationally. So I'm a big believer in the freedom to listen or to not listen. You didn't have to come to this event. Freedom to listen, but using the listening to really try to hear and really try to see why he's saying that thing and why she's saying that thing. And, Nadine Strawson likes to say, what does she say? We all know you have the right to remain silent, if your charges are, and you also have the right to not remain silent and to speak out against the ideas that you think are bad or that you just want to hear more about and so on. So I guess I would just encourage people to do more of the rational listening and rational speaking rather than let's take the platform away from this person or that person. Let's engage in a reasonable way, as we seem to have this afternoon.
Greg?
Well, first, just as a way of bookkeeping, I noticed, I'm not going to try to answer it, but I noticed we never got back to his question about families and natalism. So I won't take time to at the end to answer, but I did give a whole lecture on this once that's up on the internet called something like Reproduction in the Objectivist Ethics, and a whole section of it is on parental rights and individualism and having families and so forth. So just there is material on that if you want to go look. But the topic is, what are sort of closing thoughts on free speech? So the essentials are it's a right. rights are about what Tara was talking about, the limits, the scope, the what's up to you. What is it that you, an individual, have unilateral authority over? And what's the range of what you have unilateral authority over that doesn't prevent other people from having unilateral authority over their lives? Rights are defining the scope and the boundaries of your life. They're recognizing the need of individuals and the right of individuals and the propriety of individuals to lead their own lives by their own judgment for their own sake. And they're implementing the fact that that's what human life is about into society, and implementing the fact that relationships are a vital part of human life, but they're a vital part of the expressions of that activity. They're us leading our lives together, each by our own judgment, for our own sake, for mutual advantage. And we have to think about, like, what is the scope of your life? What is it that you can be doing that's leading your own life and not imposing on me? And what would your doing then start to impose on me? And likewise, me on you. And that's what we're understanding in understanding a freedom. And then the question is, what is the freedom of speech? And it's the freedom to express yourself within your other rights. The mere saying of something is not thereby an infringement on somebody's rights. The mere expression of an opinion is not thereby the infringement of someone's rights. There are things you can do that by using your mouth, by spreading a certain thing, you are infringing, but never just because it's an opinion being expressed. And it's recognizing that that's something that's important to protect as part of expressing our ability to lead our own lives for our own sakes by our own judgment, interacting with and deciding not to interact with people as we judge suits that. That's the essence of individualism, that's the essence of any right, and the right to free speech has to be understood in that context.
I'll come back to something you asked us early on, Alon, that I don't think we quite addressed, which is the personal significance of this issue. And for me, so I'll take a wide perspective and then a very personal perspective. So the wide perspective is, through most of history, there has not been freedom of thought. It's such an enormous achievement that for people to carve out that you have this freedom. And if you have any modicum of self-esteem, you should hold on to this freedom and fight for it. Because it's a freedom that I can think for myself, I can decide what I'm gonna look at, what I'm gonna read, who I'm gonna associate with, what arguments I'm gonna consider and not. And what is the alternative? The alternative is the government telling you, you can and cannot read this. Yeah, you can think about this, but you can't think about that. You can't associate with these people. And the idea that I would surrender that kind of control over my life to other people or to the government, and as Greg was saying, the government just is, other people vote, like it's up for vote, what I'm going to read, what arguments I'm going to consider a right, who I'm going to associate. I value my life too much to think that it's up to the vote and other people are going to decide for me. And so the First Amendment was created by people who took themselves seriously and their own lives and their own minds and that we need this freedom to figure out what we think and what we think is true. And everybody needs that freedom. And if you value your own life, then you have to value this freedom.
Well, thank you to our panel, Onkar Ghate, Greg Salmieri, and Tara Smith. Please join me in thanking them. One is again to thank the co-sponsors of the Salem Center program in Objectivism that you direct at the Salem Center, Greg, and Voices for Liberty, which is a co-sponsor of this event. And finally, as I mentioned at the beginning, if you weren't here, we have a limited number of copies of the book, which are available to UT students. If you'd like one, they are over there, and please take just one. If there aren't any and you still want one, please find me and we'll see if we can find one for you. Thank you, everyone.